and speak.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Library of Congress. My name is Larry Smith. It's nice to see so many people here before. Any first-timers? Thank you. Thank you. We've been doing this for 10 years. When we opened, we started playing the first 500 films that were on the National Film Registry, films that were significant, important. And we tried to attract people. And since then, we've been playing a lot of rare films. Like last night, we played a silent film directed by Frank Capra. Over 100 people showed up to see a film that I don't know if anybody in the room had ever seen before, with live musical accompaniment. So, come back. Come back often. I hope you enjoy it. There are a few things I got to tell you about since this is your first time. It is free, but we do have some rules. They're simple rules. We ask you not to eat, drink, smoke, spit, or chew. And we ask you to turn off your cell phone. If we catch you using your cell phone, my wife will confiscate it and will sell it on eBay for someone saying he needs the money. And we also ask you not to talk during the film because it's distracting. One of the neat things about this shrine to old movies is it's a time tunnel. You get to go back to 1939 and see the entertainment as if it was fresh. Anybody not seen this film before? Is this your first time to see the film? Okay. How many of you have seen it more than 10 times? Okay. I saw you at the meetings, yeah. And like, wonderful. Well, I got to make a few announcements before we get started. One of the things I want to thank is the young lady who was born in Indiana, Pennsylvania, which is the hometown of James Stewart, coming tonight. Anybody coming from out of state? Anybody else? A couple of folks? Wow, you guys got good taste and lots of gasoline. Let me see. Announcements. There's some stuff coming up in the future. We're already working on the March schedule, and it's not set in ink yet. But they're still talking about it, but I'm excited about Manchurian Candidate should play in March. And there's talk about Gladiator, which won the Best Picture of the Year we're playing this weekend. Also a bunch of other good films, so stay tuned for that. Now for the intro. It's an honor to introduce this film that is timeless and highly relevant. This film, if you haven't read it in the headlines, there's talk about adding earmarks to upcoming bills, which means more of the stuff this film addresses is coming back. I hope not. But anyways, I would like to dedicate tonight's screening to my friend James Cozart. His wife is here tonight. I send you. James Cozart was head of our quality control here at the Library of Congress. And I know he spent a couple of years working on Mr. Smith Goes to Washington to get it done right, putting together pieces of the original negative that was worn out. It was such a popular film, the original negative was worn and missing pieces. He married it together with picture-dip negatives, release prints. It took him a couple of years, and I want to thank James for that. Also, I want to mention this is a present to my father, who would have been 91 today. My dad took me to Washington for the first time. I want to thank him for that. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was made by my favorite director, Frank Capra. He is also the favorite director of David Packard, the man who paid for this building. The very first project he funded at the Library of Congress was the entire Capra Library. It meant that much to him. And if you haven't seen it, Mr. Smith Comes to Washington is finally available on Blu-ray, which is kind of thrilling. I bought my copy and was reading the notes in it, and it talked about the restoration and about how much they worked on it. This is an even newer restoration that's on the Blu-ray. And they said that they were able to actually find more material to help them in their patchwork to piece together an even better print of Mr. Smith. And I know about that because they found Frank Capra's personal print. And here's a picture I took of it when I mailed it to them. Frank Capra's nitrate copy that he used to play in his home for friends and family. Before this film was made, Mr. Capra had already won 3 Academy Awards for Best Director. It happened one night in 1934, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, 36, You Can't Take It With You in 1938, which is all the more remarkable if you consider they had only handed out 11 Oscars for Best Director so far. And in the 88 years since that first Oscar was awarded, only 2 other directors have won 3. William Wyler tied Capra, and John Ford got 4 Oscars. Well, in 1939, director Frank Capra was ready to walk away from Columbia Studios because Harry Cohn, the president, refused to back Capra's idea for doing a biographical film on the life of composer Chopin in Technicolor, co-starring Marlene Dietrich as George Sand. He said it would be way too expensive, and nobody would come. So Frank was ready to leave in a huff when one of his assistants handed him a 2-page outline of an unpublished story called The Gentleman from Montana. It was the tale of an innocent idealist who believes in American ideals and good government, and who gets drafted to fill in for a recently deceased senator. Capra's team said, it's another Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, and you can cast Jean Arthur, Frank Capra's favorite actress. In fact, when you see the credits for tonight's movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the first name you're going to read is Jean Arthur. That's how much she meant to him. Well, they said you could also cast Gary Cooper again. And Capra said no. If he's a young, naive man, Jimmy Stewart, who is so great and You Can't Take It With You, would be perfect. And so with his writer, Sidney Buckman, and his favorite cameraman, Joseph Walker, they went to Washington, D.C. to scout locations and to discover the city, just as would their lead character, Senator Jefferson Smith, from the top of a sightseeing tour bus. How many of you have ridden one of those? Yeah, me too. All seeing the famous sights and the hallowed sights. They were even invited to the Washington Press Club, where they met an expert who told them how things worked, giving them the insider scoop. They decided to include the press club in the story. Next, they visited the Senate and got permission to photograph it in every detail so they could replicate it for the film perfectly. They even hired an expert in parliamentary procedure and the inner workings of how Congress actually works. Capra even got to go to the White House as a guest of the press corps and saw in person Franklin D. Roosevelt handle questions about Hitler before he started his rampage across Europe, and discussions of Japan, who had just invaded China in 1939. That's when Frank got nervous about making a movie about political corruption before we might be dragged into a war. When he and his team visited the Lincoln Memorial, he saw a young boy read out loud the words of Lincoln to his grandfather, which inspired pride in the old man. This moved Capra so much, he knew he must recreate this scene in his film. Next up was the casting. Jimmy Stewart and Jean Arthur were natural made to order. Simply pure idealist and the cynical, fed up with Washington politics secretary, but with a heart of gold. But who could they get to play the silver-haired Senator Payne, that once cared, then cared less, and finally ceased to care at all? Again, an assistant said, I know an actor who looks like a senator, Claude Rains. Capra agreed. Rains was a distinguished actor who would add grace and power and had the depth to play a soul-tortured politician who had followed the wrong path. For boss Jim Taylor, and I don't want you to get confused when everybody's talking about James Taylor, this is a different James Taylor in the movie. He's the bad guy, not the singer we all know and love. To play Jim Taylor, Capra wanted his favorite villain, Edward Arnold, who always had the charm, who had all the charm in the world, but always working for the devil greed. For the love of money is the root of all evil. Frank personally selected the over 100 actors who would have speaking parts. He picked them with respect. No matter how small the roles, he treated all actors as stars, because when they were on screen, to him, they were the star, and it shows. When it came to casting the role of Vice President, Capra went way back in his memory to the very first film he ever worked on, as an extra no less. The Outcast of Poker Flat in 1919 was directed by John Ford and starred his favorite cowboy at the time, Harry Carey. Turns out Capra introduced himself to his hero, who then encouraged him in the film business. So after 20 years, it was now Capra who offered the small but plum role to the great character actor. And even though he's only got about 20 lines in Mr. Smith, it's his face that the camera cuts to show us, the audience, where our heart is. In this performance, it got Harry Carey his only Oscar nomination. So to wrap it up, I'll mention I hope you like this movie half as much as I do. Jimmy Stewart is my favorite actor, and at home I have letters from him framed on the wall. And I've copied some of those. I'll put them out after the movie. As well as autographs from Frank Capra and memories of when I used to call Capra on his birthday to wish him happy birthday. And I used to call him on my birthday because I just loved talking to him. As well as my memories of meeting Delmar Watson. He's the little boy actor with the bad teeth that gives Jimmy Stewart his new briefcase as a growing away present in the film. And my conversations with Dickie Jones, who played the page boy Richard Jones. He told me that Stewart said, just call me Dick. And if you'll hang around after the film, I will tell you after the movie how the original ending was filmed and what happens in it. I have the lobby card that shows the parade, and I'll tell you about that after the film, out in the lobby. Let's see. Oh yeah, this film was quite controversial when it opened. They actually had the premiere in Washington, D.C., where 4,000 people attended. A lot of politicians came, and actually in the middle of the movie they were kind of incensed that somebody would suggest that politicians could be corrupt, and they walked out on the film saying how un-American to even bring up that kind of an idea. Well, 2 years after the film opened, Frank was involved making propaganda films for the Army during World War II, and his wife sent him some articles she found she thought he would find interesting, and that was that when Germany took over France, shut down the supply of American films to France, all the theaters were told they could, for 1 month, play American films, and that would be the end of it. Guess what film was the most popular film in France 2 years later? In fact, one theater played only Mr. Smith Goes to Washington every day of that month. Lastly, I would like to thank my hero, Frank Capra. He was an immigrant born in Sicily, who came to this country to become a great director and an even better American. He was 6 when he got to this country. He fought in the Army in 1918, and in 1920 he became an American citizen. And I want to thank Sidney Franklin, the Jewish writer of Russian heritage, who wrote the story and the dialogue that so inspires us. I'm glad he survived being blacklisted in the 1950s because he too was a great American, and this film makes the world a better place. Out of 11 nominations, it had 11 Oscar nominations. That's the second highest. The other film that got more was something called Gone with the Wind. I really need to see that. The biggest moneymaker in 1939 was Gone with the Wind. The second biggest moneymaker in 1939 was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It made more money than The Wizard of Oz, than Stagecoach, than all the other great films like Goodbye, Mr. Chips. So, the next year, Jimmy Stewart would win for a smaller role in The Philadelphia Story, and many think it is a makeup Oscar for not winning for this amazing performance. I barely mentioned this story and message are timeless. This is part of the comedy wrap-up. But I want to close with this quote from the script. This is not comedy. Liberty is too precious a thing to be buried in books. Men should hold it up in front of them every single day of their lives and say, I'm free. I'm free to think and speak. My ancestors couldn't. I can. And my children will. Boys ought to grow up remembering that. I hope you enjoy Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and thank you for coming.